impact our body. And I'm also a researcher at the Health Got Research Institute, which is connected to the National University of Natural Medicine. And I also work up at OHSU in a variety of different labs, as Joe mentioned. My primary focus is researching how different drugs affect our brain. And absolutely, psychedelics is a primary interest to me in that because it's just so fascinating how they impact our brain and behavior. And we really kind of are just uncovering this amazing field of study in pharmacology related to that. In fact, most of the developments that we have right now, in fact, essentially the entire field of pharmacology and a lot of psychiatry even, is due to these psychedelic compounds that we discovered. Like, for example, LSD really sparked interest in serotonin and researching more about that. And that is really what led us to the breakthroughs in the field of psychiatry, serializing how serotonin affects a variety of different mental disorders and other things like that. So again, my primary focus is how drugs affect the brain, with a specific emphasis on psychedelics and how we can use them as medicines. I guess I'll go ahead and just get started on my topic, which would be microdosing. So when we talk about microdosing, I'm going to have to bring up a few disclaimers, as well as another disclaimer related to the organizations that I'm a part of. Every presentation that I do, including the one online and this virtual one that I'm doing now, is all my personal opinions and perspectives. It is not the opinions or views of any of the organizations that I just mentioned. Another disclaimer that I'm going to have to make is around the literature around microdosing. It's rather interesting. There's kind of a lot that's out there, but not a lot of research evidence. Microdosing in and of itself is relatively uncharted territory in the field of kind of scientific exploration. There's lots and lots and lots of anecdotal reports or people going on Reddit and other online forums and talking about their own experience, but there's a lot less scientific evidence that's out there. But there is a little bit of scientific evidence that have been studies that have been focused around microdosing and other things like that. I just kind of want to make it clear that any information that I present will be from the scientific literature, unless I specifically say that it's something that I pulled from anecdotal sources. That being said, what is microdosing? To understand the topic and to really talk about that, we kind of have to cover that a little bit. So microdosing is not a scientific term when we're referring to psychedelics. It's just basically something that has been used societally by many people who are part of the psychedelic culture, and the term just kind of stuck, and the researchers started talking about microdosing too. But we really don't have a set definition on what microdosing really is in the scientific realm or willing to investigate it. That being said, it seems that a lot of other kind of based on why people microdose and common themes, microdosing generally refers to three primary components. The first one being that it's a low dose below a perceptual threshold, meaning that it's a dose that we take and we don't experience any subjective intoxication effects from the substance. And I say intoxication with quotation marks. It's also a procedure that is done over time that involves multiple dosing sessions. Microdose is not something you just take one time. It's something that's done in a dosing regimen or a protocol, and it happens over a period of time. And then the third parameter seems to be it's a person who microdose has the intention of improved well-being and enhanced cognitive and or emotional processes. So kind of those three factors put together is kind of how we refer to microdoses in both the scientific field and anecdotally as well. So there are several different microdosing protocols. One of the most popular is the Fadiman approach, which involves 2 consecutive dosing days followed by 2 non-dosing days. Another popular method is the weekday approach, which would be dosing Monday to Friday and not dosing Saturday to Sunday. There's also another common approach, which is a balanced approach, which would be like microdosing every other day. So those are some of the three most common approaches. However, research has shown, involving online surveys, kind of like the one Jason put up asking about your microdosing practices, surveys like that have shown up to about 50% of people don't actually follow any of those three that I just mentioned, and they make up their own unique protocol. So basically, it seems like everybody is kind of doing something different. Two people might be doing a similar or even the same protocol, but when we're speaking in terms of kind of the body of people who microdose, the population of microdosers, everybody's kind of doing a little bit something different, which is definitely something important to consider when you're trying to think about what protocol is right for you. You could kind of think of it in the terms of like pharmacology and SSRIs and kind of common psychopharmaceutical medications that people take. Like, not everybody who's on an SSRI, even if it's the same SSRI, will take the same dose and the same dosing regimen. You know, that is determined by a psychiatrist. We meet with the psychiatrist to talk with them, and then they help to establish what, based on their experience, what dosing protocol is right for us when referring to SSRIs. The kind of the same concept works with psychedelics. Like, not a single dose will work well for everybody. We're going to have to kind of figure out what works best for individuals instead, kind of an individualistic model rather than kind of this, oh, let's make this one microdosing regimen that works for everybody. And the only way to really know what works for you is through self-experimentation. It's important to note that there's quite a lot of things that will affect how well a microdosing protocol will work for you. Those things could include the potency of the drug you're taking, your diet, more so for orally ingested psychedelics, weight, height, genetics, liver enzymes, mental health status, personality type, and tolerance, both natural and acquired tolerance, are all factors that kind of play into how microdosing strategies might work differently for different people. So when we talk about microdosing, there are these quote unquote guidelines for what common microdoses are. Like, for example, a common microdose of LSD is between 10 to 25 micrograms. Although getting up to 25 micrograms, you might actually start to feel some effects depending on your own sensitivity to LSD. But so given that, how much you actually consume is a whole nother thing to consider, because not every single tab will have the same amount. One person might have a tab with 100 micrograms. Another person might have a tab with 200 micrograms. And obviously they would take much different size chunks of the tab if there's different potencies to the drug. So that's also a very important thing to consider. That definitely relates to both LSD and mushrooms, which seem to be probably the two most common substances that are dosed with. When you deal with mushrooms, there's a whole host of different strains, just as kind of Joseph and Kayci were mentioning earlier. Like, different strains have different levels of potency, meaning a microdose for one strain might be quite different than a microdose of another strain. Not only do these vary by what species it is, it's not a plant, but a fungi. So just like any plant, depending on what soil you grow it in, the growing conditions, when you harvest it, that will change the output or the concentration of psilocybin and psilocin that you have inside of the mushrooms. So in theory, like, if you went out mushroom hunting, which I don't necessarily condone, and you found two patches, they might have different potencies, even if they're the same species of mushroom. So there's a lot of variability that comes around. So it can be a little challenging to determine appropriate microdoses with mushrooms, but that's not like LSD is any different. It has a different set of challenges. LSD is extremely potent, which means that it can be dangerous to handle, generally in large quantities. Like, for example, there's like liquid LSD is probably one of the most dangerous because it's very, very potent. A single drop of it can will essentially intoxicate you. And so if you were to work with liquid LSD and it was to spill on your hand, accidents do happen, and that would be like taking a dose that is much, much larger than a typical recreational dose. Or if you were just trying to dose out your microdoses and a little bit from the cap got on your hand, your day is going to be a little funky, definitely so. Another thing to consider is that pure LSD is extremely potent. And so what they do is they actually inject a filler into most liquid LSD to reduce to make it so that one drop is one dose. And then obviously the potency of the drug can change depending on how much filler you put into there. It's also difficult to handle. It degrades in the presence of light, heat, and oxygen. So you have to store it away from that. And if you don't have proper storing techniques, it can kind of slowly degrade over time. There's also, with LSD, more than mushrooms, there's a lot of fake LSD, unfortunately, that's circulating with like research chemicals being sold as LSD. So it's very important to kind of test your substance to make sure you're consuming the right thing. It might be better to take an actual raw form of mushroom rather than somebody who's claiming that it's in a pill form or a chocolate form or another kind of form like that. And then kind of as I've been saying, there's just variations in potency, both for psilocybin and LSD. So like you might say, oh, 1/4 of a tab is a microdose for one potency level of LSD versus 1/10 of a tab might be a microdose for another potency level. So then we get down to, so there's potency, but there's also tolerance to drugs. And microdosing is done repeatedly over time. Tolerance to drugs builds up. That's just a natural thing that happens. And that's what's called acquired tolerance. And basically, acquired tolerance means that the more you have receptors that the psychedelic binds to, and that's what produces the cognitive effects. So the more you microdose, the more the cells go, hey, I'm getting way too much activity. My receptors are being activated way too much. So the cell actually deletes some of its receptors. So it has less receptors for the drug to bind to. And when there's less receptors for it to bind to, it reduces its effect or its cognitive effect. So that's how we can kind of see as people continue to use a substance, such as in microdosing regimens, the tolerance kind of tends to go up and up and up to the point where somebody can't receive the same benefits from the drug. So they have to either increase the dose to continue with that effect or so on and so forth. Now, that's an interesting thing to consider with microdosing, because in microdosing, you're not trying to actually experience any subjective effects. So it's something to consider, like, should I continue increasing my dose as time goes on, or should I not? Which is something interesting. And research has shown that even if you don't experience subjective effects from the drugs, they are affecting your brain and changing your body. For example, there are some kids who have a very high sensitivity to alcohol. So they drink like a fish and they just put it back and they're like, oh, this isn't bad for me because I'm not feeling anything, but the drug is still affecting their brain. So maybe that has the same thing with microdosing, and it's not the biggest thing we'll have to consider, but tolerance is something that builds up over time. And research has shown that continuously, repeatedly administering LSD, the same dose over a course of several days, by day 4, there was no longer any subjective experience of her effects. So that's roughly, I guess, how long it would take for consecutive dosing before you either need to increase the dose or kind of keep it at the same level. Now, an important thing to mention, I forgot to mention in my PowerPoint, was that downregulation occurs, which is when the receptors count decreases. But if you stop using the drug, the receptors will come back. Your brain's not messed up forever. The receptors will grow back, and that's called upregulation. And then there's this kind of, this is more anecdotal. So that's acquired tolerance. And then the anecdotal is more the natural tolerance, which is a phenomenon that has been reported by many anecdotal reports. There are a lot of people who describe having low sensitivity to LSD or extremely high sensitivity to LSD, and it's their first time ever consuming it. So there obviously seems to be some kind of differences there. And that could relate. There hasn't been a lot of research to understand why there really is this natural sensitivity or tolerance to LSD. But kind of a line of thought would be if it's related to this receptor upregulation and downregulation, maybe the people who are more sensitive just naturally have less receptors in our brain, and the people who are more sensitive naturally have more. That could be a possibility, although there are some other theories. Other theories are it's more related to psychological factors, like the idea to resist a drug, or there are some people who are just not as okay with letting go. And those kind of people, I guess we could call them the people who had scored low on the big five personality trait openness to experience. Those kinds of people reportedly through studies seem to have less effects from psychedelics if they're less willing to be kind of open-minded and kind of go with the trip. There seems to be kind of less of these like breakthroughs and beneficial effects that kind of occur. So it could be related to more psychological factors, it could be related to physiological factors, or it could be a combination of both. But it's definitely a phenomenon that has been anecdotally reported, but we need a little bit more research on it. It's definitely something important that we need to cover. So in kind of summary of what I've been talking about, it's your responsibility to research the safety, the efficacy, the dosage, contraindications, and the side effects of microdosing. Everybody responds to microdosing differently. Just because one dosing protocol works for someone else does not mean it will work for you. And you will have to figure out on your own what substance, what dose, what dosing protocol works best for you. And it's important to note, if you're interested in microdosing, you're leaving the seemingly protected big world pharma, and you're really just going to have to kind of figure it out on your own by researching multiple sites and safety. And you'll have to find reliable sources. As I mentioned before, you'll have to actually make sure you're consuming what you think you are consuming. That's obviously a very important part of microdosing to get the beneficial effects. And you also have to like consider dosing, what dosing is appropriate. Recommendation that has been given to me would be starting at 0.1 grams of psilocybin cubinescence if you are the anxious type, and 0.2 grams if you are the deep end kind of a pool person. But kind of the line of thought is just less of a drug has less effects. So it's probably a good idea to start off with less and slowly work your way up to more. So basically covering the safety, the effects and drawbacks of microdosing. And research, kind of psychological effects have been reported as improvements in energy, mood, cognition, concentration, management of stress, creativity, spatial awareness, productivity, language capabilities, relationships, and visual capabilities, and reductions in anxiety, depression, addiction, pain relief. There's also been reports of low-level associative learning, extinction learning or unlearning, and flexibility of behavior and thought patterns. And interestingly, research has shown that psychedelics can produce beneficial behavioral effects without drastically altering perception, meaning that kind of the underlying concept of psychedelics is we consume psychedelics over a period of time, not with the goal of really experiencing the subjective effects, but more trying to cultivate the psychological benefits of consuming psychedelics that will translate into psychological effects for us. And when I mean psychedelic effects, I mean more of the acute, actual, like when you consume a substance, the intoxication effects versus the long-term beneficial effects. Research has also shown that there are physiological changes that occur, such as neuroplasticity in the cortex, which is the growth of new neurons. And interestingly enough, research has shown that neuroplasticity is higher for microdosing than taking larger doses of psychedelics, which is really interesting. Also synaptogenesis, which is neuroplasticity is the growth of new neurons, but synaptogenesis is the growth of the functional components of neurons. So the axons, the dendrites, axon terminals, and all of those kinds of things, which again, just like synaptogenesis, is higher with microdosing than with macrodosing. So there's also an inflammatory effect that also occurs in peripheral nervous tissues, which is something that's relatively interesting. And there's also slight changes in heart rate. So there was one study that came out in 2013 that I thought was particularly interesting. They looked at microdosing psilocybin in rat models. And basically what they did was they taught the rats to fear a very small tone. And they would do that by putting the rats in a cage. They would play a small buzzer, and then 10 seconds after the buzzer went off, they would shock the mice. A small electrical shock would go to the floor of the cage. All the mice would get shocked. This is kind of stimulus conditioning, if we kind of think back to that. And basically they found that then they tried to get the mice to no longer fear the tone, because the mice would freeze after they trained them to fear that tone. So after they no longer feared the tone, they would try and train the mice to not do that, and they would see how psilocybin affected that. They basically found that mice that had a large dose of psilocybin no longer feared the tone by trial 10, and the mouses that were on the microdosing of psilocybin no longer feared the tone by trial 3. So they were able to extinguish their fear much, much higher. Yeah, it seems like I guess I've run out of time a little bit. There's a few more points I wanted to cover. I guess I'll just cover them extremely quickly. Basically, it seems microdosing has an indirect modulation over dopamine. So psychedelics affect serotonin networks, and then it seems like psychedelics effect on serotonin networks then goes and impacts dopamine networks. And a common misconception about dopamine is not the pleasure neurotransmitter, it's the motivation neurotransmitter. It's what allows us to get up and move, which might explain why when we microdose, we have increased motivation and less distractibility and procrastinations and other things like that. And I'll cover safety incredibly quickly. Basically, no research trial has ever never found any negative effects that have occurred with microdosing. Generally, when we're assessing safety, we think of it in prospective and retrospective terms. That's kind of how we analyze that. Prospective meaning that would kind of be like, retrospective essentially would be like we give somebody a drug and we monitor them over a period of time and watch for adverse reactions, versus a prospective way would be to think about, okay, what are the possible negative effects of these substances kind of over periods of time on people. And there has never been any serious adverse reaction reported in a microdosing study. However, research suggests that it is possible that there is a microdosing, negative adverse reaction with microdosing, but the chances of that happening seem to be incredibly low. Psychedelics are relatively safe when we think of them in terms of what's called therapeutic index, which is the difference between a dose that you need to feel something versus a dose you need to have toxic effects from. So you want that to be bigger. Psychedelics have a very, very large difference between a dose needed to feel effects and the dose needed to have toxic effects. That's one safety, and they also have a very low addiction potential. So considering those two factors, psychedelics are quite safe, even compared to common substances such as nicotine, alcohol, and caffeine. But as I mentioned, there are kind of potential negative interactions. Specifically, it seems that activating these serotonin networks has an influence over the heart and kind of heart monitoring and blood pressure and other things like that. Serotonin actually it's a neurotransmitter, but it stands for blood thinner. That's kind of what it's referred to because there's just so much of it. So essentially, because of that relationship, there are some potential heart complications that could happen from microdosing regimens, such as valvopathies and other things like that. Although, again, this has never ever been reported, observed. It's just kind of, and we need a lot more trials to really understand these relationships. And I say when I say trials, I mean preclinical trials, not with humans, but with more animal models to really assess possible adverse reactions and possibilities. So yeah, I kind of had to breeze through that last bit a little bit, but yeah, I'll stop it there.
Thank you so much, Aaron. I just love it when you present. So I just wanted to let the people know who just came on the call. So we're going to open up the group for Q&A for either Aaron, myself, or Joe for about 15 or 20 minutes. And then we're going to do breakout groups. So you're going to be in a group with like 3 or 4 people, I think, for about 15 minutes so that you can discuss between yourselves what's been coming up for you and share. And then we're going to come back into the main room where, you know, everybody has the opportunity to share again if they'd like to. I think Joe and I and Aaron and Jason are going to go ahead and stay in the main room when you're in your breakout session. So if you want to come back to the main room early, you're more than welcome to do that. So we'll go ahead and take questions right now. You could either raise your hand, and how you do that is you go down to the participants, manage participants, and there's a raise hand at the bottom, or you can just, like, you know, raise your hand on the screen. So the floor is now open for questions or comments. And also, one more thing, if you could just observe the principle of step up, step back, you know, just be aware that there's a lot of people on the call, and, you know, allowing for other people to ask their questions or participate. And if you have some fear about that, you know, go ahead and step up and you know, walk through that, because all of you is what makes this call great. So the floor is open now. Go ahead, Ginger.
Hello, can you hear me?
Uh-huh.
Okay. I actually have 2 questions, but the one that I'm kind of more interested in right now is, if you're taking it for anxiety, if you're microdosing for anxiety, do you benefit even if you're not doing like therapeutic integration, you know, journaling and meditation and that sort of thing? Does it actually still do something for anxiety? And then the second question, or should I wait on the second question?
You could go ahead and ask the other question.
Second question is just, how do you even know if you're actually benefiting versus it's just the placebo effect?
Yeah, no, those are great questions. Regards to the first one, I would say that yes, there are benefits even if you're not doing any kind of journaling or other work related to managing anxiety. There should be benefits from psychedelics regardless related to that. One of the most common things reported by many people who microdose is kind of lower anxiety levels. Is kind of a common theme that tends to be reported in the literature. Although interesting caveat to that is one of the most common complaints is that people have with microdosing is also anxiety. But we also have to kind of consider what is that. Maybe it's people who are, you know, just enrolled in a psychedelic microdosing study. They've never tried psychedelics before, so they probably have a little bit of anxiety related to consuming it. But that's just something interesting to consider. But there are physiological things that taking psychedelics do that actually it helps people to improve what's called their emotional regulation. So the ability to kind of like regulate your emotions. So that's kind of my response to the first one. The second one, I love that question, and I would actually kind of respond back with a counter question. Is that really a bad thing if, you know, you're receiving beneficial effects and it's the placebo effect? You know, like if the outcome of the treatment is the placebo effect, then, you know, and it's producing positive beneficial things, then that's something to consider. I read this one study, and it was so great, and they were talking about how, you know, yeah, microdosing and psychedelics might be the placebo effect, but they said rather than just being this kind of annoying artifact of psychedelics, microdosing, other things like that, we should take advantage of the placebo effect. And if the placebo effect is helping to reduce people's, if it's helping to get people to the outcome that they want to be, then why should we stop that? Like, you know, if that is what psychedelics do, and research is showing it's not, but if that is all they are, is just this giant placebo effect, like people are reading online, oh yeah, psychedelics help with everything, and they're taking them and it's working, then maybe we should exploit that rather than focusing too much on it. But yeah, I would say the main thing to do would be to kind of reflect on the effects that it's having on you. And maybe the best way to do that would be to journaling. Maybe that journal wouldn't necessarily be a journal related to managing your anxiety, but just related to kind of like a self-qualitative study that you could do on yourself, just taking notes about, you know, the effects, and just kind of like look at that data that you wrote about yourself over time and just see if there's a beneficial effect. Another way to do it is, I'm sure there's quite a lot of online surveys about like wellness and all those kind of things, positive moods. I mean, maybe taking online surveys. I don't mean those like Facebook surveys. I mean like actual validated surveys, which probably I could find if they're too hard to dig up and share with the group. But that might be a way to kind of assess yourself. Like those surveys might be like, how much distractibility did you feel yesterday on a scale of 1 to 10, kind of a thing, and you can kind of see over time how those changes. But that was me kind of digressing a little bit. Pretty much, it's like I don't really think that we should really worry about the placebo effect too much. It's the outcome that we're worried about. And if it's the placebo that's getting us the outcome, then awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ginger. David, do you have a question? Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi, this is David. Quick question. So on psilocybin, obviously you already spoke on different strains, different batches can have different strengths, but can there be different effects, like more give you energetic, more give you whatever effects? Because pretty much, is there a difference? Can there be a difference of effects? Not like the strength though. Thanks.
Absolutely. I definitely believe that there can be a difference of effects. And I mean, that's kind of, it kind of is a clash between anecdotal and scientific concepts when we kind of start talking about that. Because anecdotally, I've heard people say like, oh yeah, Cubanescents are like super visual, and Pinnacent, or they're like extremely body, you know, and all those kind of things. So I've definitely heard like anecdotal reports about kind of differences between different strains. But if we're speaking scientifically, pharmacologically, then both of these no matter what psychedelic mushroom it is, they all have the psilocybin present in them, and psilocybin will affect your body the same way. The psilocybin in one mushroom versus the psilocybin in another mushroom, they will both affect your body the same way. One thing though to consider is that each mushroom has different levels of psilocybin in it. And there's also something to consider, that there are probably more than just those two active ingredients in mushrooms. There's probably a whole host of different ingredients, just like with cannabis. Like you'll see different strains will have different profiles, different levels of cannabinoids. And I assume that mushrooms kind of have a similar thing, where they have a whole host of different active ingredients in them, and different strains of mushrooms might have different levels. If not, one has one active ingredient, one has another, which can produce different effects. So yes, I agree that there are different effects between different strains. Not something that's really been researched a lot. Pretty much if you look up almost any research study, they rarely use mushrooms. They mostly use the extracted ingredient of psilocin or psilocybin. That's the most common thing that's done in studies. But if they ever do use an actual mushrooms, it's almost always p-cuban essence.
Can you hear me? You know, that's the basic problem we have, or not problem, but fact is that when you get to plants, when you get to plant medicine, dosing becomes erratic. You know, the reason the researchers use the chemical versions is because they want precise dosing that they can use in their research. But those of us who are just trying to manage ourselves, or, you know, take our own medicines, you know, use mushrooms all have different compounds, and I'm certain that science has no clue what's really in mushrooms and what's an active ingredient and what isn't. You know, for years they thought THC equaled pot. You know, we now know that there's huge numbers of active ingredients that change everything, and you know, et cetera. So you know that the fact is, when you get to plant medicine, most of the rules that you've learned in science, you know, really don't hold around dosing. You got to figure it out yourself, you know. And also, you know, there are. I have a daughter who's got a paradoxical response when she takes when she starts microdosing. She gets depressed. You know, that can happen. You're on your own. Figure it out.
I really appreciate you saying that about kind of plant medicine and being an integrative medicine researcher. Integrative medicine is the combination of both naturopathic, complementary, and integrative medicine. It's both a combination of like naturopathic medicine and conventional Western medicine. So it's kind of the combination of both put together. And it's such an interesting place to be as a researcher, kind of looking at both sides. And I see pretty big differences. Obviously, on the naturopathic side of things, we're very interested in plant medicines and other kind of compounds like that. And a lot of the naturopathy doctors and just people in that field look at the conventional Western medicine and they kind of scoffed at it almost and be like, it's this kind of reductionistic perspective. They're always trying to find this single sole active ingredient that they can isolate and turn into like a pharmaceutical and things like that. Which is why we see, you know, in a lot of studies, they're trying to extract the raw ingredient, you know, psilocybin, and turn that into something that can be used. But on the naturopathic side of things, on more the holistic side of things, we don't really have that reductionistic perspective. We look at the whole plant, you know, like all of the active ingredients, like the soil it was grown in, like all of these factors, like the practice or the tradition that is done in taking the medicine and other factors like that. Like, so it's interesting to consider different perspectives in medicine that kind of clash between each other.
Yeah, I think that this, you know, this whole movement with psychedelic medicine is really giving us the opportunity to take responsibility for ourselves and, you know, develop a, you know, a personal relationship with the medicines and experiment and see, you know, see what works specifically for you. So like, you know, Aaron was talking about when you go to, you know, a psychiatrist and they prescribe an SSRI and they say, you know, this is the amount and this is what you should take, and they give you the prescription for it. And so it's, you know, we're really, you know, turning our well-being over to another individual, which, you know, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But I'm a huge advocate for experimenting, you know, with the medicines and seeing, you know, does LSD work better for me, or mushrooms, or, you know, there's other medicines to microdose with. You know, looking at the different dosages, the different regimens, like Aaron was talking about, there's a number of different regimens, you know, 1 day on, 2 days off, 5 days on, 2 days off. And then once you develop a relationship and find out what works for you, then you can start, you know, really using it the way that you, you know, in a way that benefits you. So yeah. Tristan, you had a question? Go ahead and unmute yourself.
All right. Hi, everybody. So I have been taking doses of LSD that I don't know would fit into a stricter sense of microdosing. For me personally, as I know this could be different for, each person. For me, I've been taking like 25 to 35 micrograms, and it gives me very noticeable and fantastic effects, but it's starting to move into feeling subjective effects. It's moving into that realm. Like, for example, I'll just give one. Like, I notice my visual perception is becoming more HD, like a little bit more saturation to colors, but it's not turning into a thing where I'm having distortions in my visual field or my mind is becoming too chaotic. It's just I'm edging on straddling microdosing and this area that's maybe not microdosing. So my question is like, how do you all think it would work in categorically defining this dosage and perceptive change? Because I wonder, like, for the psychedelic community, is this going to be something that's restricted? Like, that will the microdosing conversations only be for non-subjective, like you don't feel anything at all, like in a way, but you still have, maybe cognitive increases, and like, how do we categorize that? Is there going to be a distinction, do you think, emerging in discourse? And that's kind of I think that's pretty much a sum of my question.
Yeah, that's a great question. And kind of just one thing that comes to mind if we're talking about categories, one really important thing that I kind of mentioned earlier was that microdoses work differently for everybody. So yeah, I would say 25 to 35 micrograms of LSD is, I would say that's kind of out of the range of a microdose, but a microdose might be 35 micrograms for one person versus a microdose might be 5 or 10 milligrams or micrograms for another person. So, it actually, that could be a microdosing dose depending on a person's own sensitivity to it. And now I know you were saying you were perceiving differences in colors, these kind of subjective effects. Was that an acute state during the psychedelic experience, or was that like afterwards, just in general?
No, it was during it. It was not so acute, kind of vague, but I was judging that based, contrasted A and B to my sober mind. There's a difference there, but it's interesting because it doesn't move past that. Really, I don't get into more of what I would feel would be so distinctively different than microdosing in a way. And I actually find when I like move into like, say, 20 micrograms, 25 micrograms, the effects that I feel with lower doses just kind of bloom into a bigger fruition. Just like quality of thought and clarity of thought, I should put. It's more valuable to me than going so non-perceptive. So
I'm going to try to speak here. I don't have, my camera's not working, so I can't wave my hands. I can't seem to get it into it. Can't make my presence known otherwise, but I was going to raise some questions about that issue of what constitutes a microdose as well, because this is something that's bothered me for a long time. When I first tried microdosing, I can't start my video. When I first tried microdosing LSD, I took 8 micrograms the first day, and I had powerful sleep disruption, when I went to sleep 16 hours later, and concluded that 8 micrograms was way more than a microdose for me. I've gone back and tried 4, and 4 was still perceptible. And I think it depends on your mind and your body. I don't think that there's I'm not convinced that there's a dose. There probably is a dose, but that I can take that is completely below the level of my perception. So I'm not sure that the idea that it has to be less than you can perceive is really a valid criteria, because if you're extremely highly body and mind aware, you're gonna have a hard time finding that dose. So that's kind of one of the things that I feel about this whole discussion.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and respond to that because I understand exactly what everybody's talking about, and in general, when people are talking about microdosing, it's a subperceptual, or it's an amount that creates a subperceptual response, and that's a little confusing because it's like, well, we want to shift, but why are you saying that it's subperceptual? Subperceptual is specifically in regards to a psychedelic effect. So seeing colors, seeing tracers, that kind of thing. Now, with that being said, each person gets to develop their own relationship with the medicine and use it for their own purposes. And I think that it's really important, in order to have clarity for that, to create a journaling practice and, write down, dose day, this is how much I took, these are the kind of things that happened, and really track it for a period of time so that, as an individual, each person can see, what the benefit is and what the shifts are. And like Ginger was asking, well, here I want to take it for anxiety, and what if it doesn't help with anxiety? Well, it may not help with anxiety, but it might help in 5 or 6 different areas. You might be more creative. You might be able to connect information better. You might sleep better, have better dreams. Now, with the LSD microdosing, what I have done in the past is taken the 100 micrograms, put it in a 10-ounce bottle of water, let that sit overnight, and then at 1 ounce is going to be 10 micrograms. For me, 10 micrograms is perceptual, so I'm really sensitive. So I would go down to 5 micrograms. So it really does, it's individual. And I think we get to take a journey with that and experiment with it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it. And kind of one thing I mentioned earlier is there's just no set upon definition of what microdosing really is. I described those 3 parameters which commonly describe microdosing, but there's no consensus on what microdosing is, not only in the scientific community, but in society, like how we're dealing with here, like what is a microdose? And I think rather than trying to, my personal opinion, and when I say this, rather than trying to look at kind of specific dosing ranges that people are taking and other things like that, I think how to define if somebody's taking a microdose or a microdosing regimen is their goal or what they're trying to accomplish by taking it. And I believe that somebody who is microdosing is a person who is trying to experience as little subjective or acute effects of psychedelic intoxication. And I'm referring to the tracers, being high in the moment. Somebody who's not trying to achieve any kind of breakthroughs or anything like that from an intense psychedelic experience, but rather obtain long-term benefits from consuming the substance. There might be a better way to word that, but that's in my mind. I think it's very much related to the purpose and why somebody is taking the psychedelic. So I believe that anybody who is, consuming it to not have a trip that day, but to get some kind of beneficial effects for the long term, and their goal is to achieve as little subjective effects while under the influence of the substance, then I believe that is what microdosing is. Yeah.
So
Thank you.
I'd like to relate something happened to me. I got up to 0.33 grams. And at 33 grams of psilocybin mushrooms, of cubensis mushrooms, at 33 grams, I had about an hour after I took them, I had about an hour where I was, I guess high is the appropriate term, but not very high. I was, how I said it then, and I think is a good description, I was discombobulated. My mind was clearly, I was not able to process things quite as fast as usual. And for a while that was fine. I just got used to it and just planned that it wouldn't be, I wouldn't be doing something critical. And then at one point I found myself trying to cross Belmont Avenue during rush hour while I was coming on to that hour. And I vowed I was never going to do that again once I got across the damn street. And so, to me, there are two problems with dosing higher, dosing up to perceptual levels. And one is that you find yourself in a critical situation and you're not functioning at the level you want. And the other is, theoretically at least, you're likely to have develop tolerance quickly, more quickly. And so I went back to dosing down to 0.22, and I'll go up to 2.23 now, but really won't go much beyond that. I just like to say, as an aside, there's a practice in Europe where everybody takes the kind of doses that Tristan, you were talking about. Everybody, the therapist, and they have group therapy sessions where everybody is moderately stoned on LSD. That's something I'm ready to do, but it's a regular practice.
Thank you, Joe. And Raquel, I did see that you had your hand raised, but what we're going to do is go ahead and do a breakout session right now so that, everybody can, share it in smaller groups. And I think we're going to, just look at, 3 to 5 minutes each sharing, and then we'll come back into the main room and people can ask more questions or, share what came up for them. So Jason, do you want to go ahead and